Hey everybody, Dawn Zoldai here. Welcome back to your full crew. Have a spectacular episode planned for you. I'm your co-host, and we've got
Hey, I'm Mike Peel, your other co host, and we've got some great guests today and some awesome topics. We're going to be talking about SpaceX and T Mobile collaborating in an amazing effort to cover the United States. We're also going to be talking about the preservation of cultural heritage sites in the Ukraine. We're going to be talking about IoT, satellite IoT security, and Dawn's articles always seem to have the best kind of keywords here. So we're going to be talking about some vampires in Ukraine also later today. We've got some amazing guests, like I said, but first I'd like to remind you, if you like anything that you see, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the like button, and set the notification bell to all notifications. You could also go to our website, fullcrew.io, and subscribe there so you never miss a beat about what's going on. Let's go over to our guests. I'm going to introduce them. And Carla Lauter. Carla, can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. I'm the editorial analyst and conference chair for Geo Week, which is the coming together of a couple of shows that you guys might have been familiar with, SPAR 3D, ILMF, and AEC Next. I also do some work for commercial UAV, so you'll see me at that event next week as well. Do a bunch of basically editorial direction over there and also help plan the conference program for Geo Week.
And Jennifer Richter. So Jennifer Richter works at Akin Gump. Jennifer, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, you bet. Hi, and thanks for having me, Mike and John. I lead the Telecom Media and Technology practice here at Akin Gump, which encompasses all kinds of things: wireless, satellite, advanced aviation technologies, autonomous systems. So a lot of fun we're having over here, and great to be with you today.
Fantastic. And we're going to start with your article, which is about T-Mobile and SpaceX joining forces. Tell us a little bit about this article and why you thought it was important.
Yeah, and you're going to see a lot more articles. This was just from the TMO stream last week because that was all that was available, but there are a bunch of articles out there now. This was really exciting news. So, I think we all know and are aware that there are places in the United States where there isn't great mobile coverage. And that certainly has been an issue for people trying to get connected with broadband, and our government has billions of dollars available these days to build out broadband in areas where it doesn't exist. And that is super and very much needed. But last week there was this very exciting announcement between T-Mobile and SpaceX about joining forces in order to provide that coverage to these areas that are unserved starting in 2023. And this is just tremendous news because, of course, it'll be super for people on the ground. And I think they're thinking initially this will just be text messaging and SMS, so this is not, full-blown broadband, which other programs are really looking to fill that gap. But what I find really tremendous about this is we've been for years talking about how are we going to better integrate these terrestrial wireless networks and these satellite networks and enable better service on the ground to fill in those dead areas, but also in the air. As part of the autonomous systems work that many of us are involved in, that's often a criticism. Sure, we'd like to use the commercial wireless networks to support UAS, but there are these dead zones, and how do we respond to that? And so I think this very important work by SpaceX and T-Mobile might start to answer that question.
Yeah, absolutely. As Don and I can relate, getting coverage when we're out in the fields to do these streams is a huge deal, right? And when you actually go across the country and you find that there are essentially these dead zones, you wonder what this means in terms of economic viability for that region. And it deeply affects people. Being connected to the internet is essentially, some people have said it should even be a human right at this point. So, Carla, what's your take on this?
Well, it is definitely an equity issue because if you think about it, you can hardly do any business now without having to access the internet in some way. You can hardly bank without it. You can't get educational resources. You can't get access to any services that you might need. without an internet connection. And of course, we have public spaces like libraries and things that are helping to fill that need. But that doesn't help you, when you're in the middle of farmland. It doesn't help you, when you're miles and miles away from anywhere you can access that. And even having a lifeline of communication for people who are in more remote areas, even at that texting and SMS level, is a huge opportunity for us to kind of really get people safer, get people more access to what they need, let alone enabling all of those business cases that you mentioned.
To Carla's point, I was at Home Depot yesterday, and they give a military discount, but in order to receive it, you have to have an app downloaded to your phone. So, to her point about how pervasive just having internet connectivity is, so if I was at a Home Depot in a remote location, I couldn't download that app, then, and they were talking about how a number of veterans, they just don't even know how to use sometimes, the internet or these apps, so, that's a really big deal. And then the idea of, kind of building on this pervasive nature of the internet, how many times have any of you been driving out in the middle of nowhere using your app for position navigation time, right? Basically a GPS app, whether it's Waze, right? WAZE, or Google Maps or something. And all of a sudden you hit a dead zone and you're like, oh my God, where do we go? That actually happened to me a couple years ago. We were, a colleague and I from the Air Force Academy were driving down to a nuclear testing facility in New Mexico. And we were literally in the middle of nowhere, and our map stopped working. And it probably took us an extra hour to get there because we had no idea where we were. So the benefits of this, just from basic navigation to daily life, they're just so significant.
So,
and I'll just jump back in. And I'm sorry, Mike.
No,
I just want to say that the work SpaceX is doing here is so important and groundbreaking, right? These low Earth orbit satellites that they are launching in the thousands are providing coverage already today in areas where we haven't had it, right? And so now connecting that with our terrestrial wireless systems makes it even more powerful. Over to you, Mike.
Yeah, so I actually experienced what Dawn was talking about literally this weekend. I went up to New Paltz for a family trip, and one of the things when you're on the mountain and you see these cliffs and you're like, God forbid I fall or anything bad happen to anybody, and you're looking and your cell coverage isn't there, you're like, what happens if there's an incident? And it's funny, when you, not funny haha, but when you actually go into the park, they ask for your ID, your license plate, they take all that down, and I bet that's just in case your car is there for 3 days, they go looking, So clearly connectivity has all these other layers to it. One thing I wanted to ask you, Jennifer, though, is I saw it's about 2 to 3 megabits per second up and down. That doesn't seem like a lot when we're looking at 35 is kind of like standard for streaming Netflix. Guaranteed for emergency uses, you probably only need to get a text through or a location through. But in terms of like rich media, which is important for education, it doesn't seem like this will get us there, right? There's more work to be done.
That's right. Two different purposes here. So I think this coordination between T-Mobile and SpaceX is going to provide text messaging, SMS, sort of low data, as you're pointing out, but sort of a critical connection where you don't have it. Separately, if you were just subscribing to the SpaceX broadband internet access, you would find that the speeds are quite a bit higher up and down. And that's why I was mentioning that there's all of this funding available for building out broadband in these remote and unserved areas. One thing I will note there, which is really important, our government has changed the standards by which they measure adequate broadband. So it used to be that it was 20 down and a few up, maybe it was 20 and 3, was adequate broadband as they had defined it. Now it's actually 100 down.
Wow.
That's what they're looking to fund. So what's really important for the listeners to know is if you're in an area that has broadband but the speeds aren't great and the capacity isn't great, that's all going to change because the government's actually going to fund building out those networks to 100 megabits per second downstream.
And getting back to this agreement, I hate to use the FAA's language here, but it's almost like this kind of crawl, walk, run approach. Like they alluded to this idea of kind of buying into advanced plans. And then also T-Mobile has an open invitation to different carriers around the world to collaborate to make this a global connection, not just a United States connection. So the beginning of something big, I think, really big.
Completely agree. And then, if we think about, so now let's go up into the air. The amount of data that's needed in order for aircraft to be able to communicate where they are and to communicate essential operational information is quite a bit less than what humans need for broadband. So this kind of collaboration actually could provide that connectivity in remote areas where it's really essential when, aircraft, unmanned aircraft principally are flying. So think about the really interesting work NASA's doing with wildfire mitigation. Some of those areas, in our national forests, there is no connection out there. But think about what this could provide. So, and I know, SpaceX and Starlink already are thinking about applications in the air. So this is really an important thing to watch.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's really interesting. People, I think, overestimate how much data you would need to keep an aircraft in the sky and know where it is, right? And what its health is per engine. You could get troves of data, and it still is probably going to be like less than a kilobyte, right? Because it's very, very simple textual data, and so yeah, that's with 2 to 3 megabits per second, you could actually get quite a lot for advanced air mobility, drones. Complex delivery systems would be able to be sustained probably on a network, even with that low bandwidth. So exciting times, certainly. So, but these aren't the only providers of this kind of gap coverage, right? There's other firms that are kind of working towards this too.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and with all of the federal government money that's available, we're going to see a big push into this area. So for the Broadband Equity and Access Deployment Act, it's known as BEAD. The states actually will be administering the funding there. It's money that's coming through NTIA and then through the states, and companies will probably start to be able to apply for that next year. We're waiting on conclusion of broadband mapping so that we know as a nation where people really, have the broadband and at the adequate speeds and do not. And then the states will be able to start rolling that money out. There's a lot of information on that. I think we've got some stuff up on our website, videos that go through those programs. But yeah, I would, you should expect that many of the rural broadband providers that are out there today and others are going to be actively participating in this program and helping to build out broadband where we need it.
That's probably a great segue because as data is flowing up and down from space to the earth and everywhere in between, protecting that data, having security of it, I think is really critical. And I think that's probably a great segue into Mike's article this week.
Yeah, so two things that I hadn't really thought about before. Excuse me if the dog comes wandering in the room. So two things I hadn't thought about before: satellite IoT as a term. And then secondly, clearly the need for security if you're going to be beaming down data to critical industrial processes up and down, actually. What does the security of that signal look like, and can it be interrupted? So the Industry IoT Consortium, it started its industrial internet framework and also a maturity model for security for IoT devices. That are going to be using this, I guess, satellite communication. This also makes sense to me for IoT devices that, if you have really tiny, small sensors and you want to distribute them and get as much information as possible from them, it makes it so much harder to deploy them at any scale if they have to have a hard line connection. So this really kind of does open the idea of real edge computing, kind of like a net of sensors that are just everywhere. And the utility for that, I mean, it can scale in so many different directions. Just one off the top of my mind would be actual carbon credit tracking to make sure that specific trees are being moved, nutrients in soil for farming. All of this kind of just makes sense that you wouldn't want to have to run wires, right? So I think this is a great advancement in IoT tech. It kind of shows maturity that we weren't seeing before, and it kind of rolls into what I was talking about with smart cities last week. So who wants to comment first?
I have kind of a thought on this too, is that IoT, even when it, kind of started, got this bad rap for being unsecure, right? Like it just, my toaster's talking to my, laundry,
my fridge,
my fridge and everything like that, right? So I'm wondering kind of this, industry IoT consortium, do you think they'll have an impact on the consumer devices as well? Because it's a two-way street, right? Your device has to talk to your recipient, gathering the data. So, when you're talking these industrial applications, you can put security at the recipient side, but you might also have to put security at the transmission side. So I'm just kind of a little bit curious as to how they're going to kind of, sway the industry to kind of adopt that on both sides, because it does kind of have to be a partnership and a collaboration to make sure that transmission of information is actually secure on both ends.
Yeah, I would assume, because I'm generally cynical about these things, that it would mostly be incidental for how it trickles down to the consumer. So we've produced this specific thing for a commercial or industrial process. Just so happens that we could also sell these to consumers, because consumer demand for that security, as much as we hear it, it doesn't actually filter back to them not buying it, right? Insecure products. And ultimately, that's what going to drive what I think consumer products are made. Jennifer, any comments from the spectrum side on this, or even just from the security and law side?
I had a similar thought to Carla. I was wondering, as I was reading it, why there was this focus on industrial versus commercial. And then I was just thinking about industrial IoT in terms of, the bandwidth and latency required in order to provide the level of service needed to serve industry, and thinking that it makes some sense to me that you might be able to accomplish some of this on satellite. And if you really did focus it on industrial versus commercial, you might have enough bandwidth available to actually provide a pretty good service with a decent latency rating. But that might not be possible if you open that up to commercial, just because there's, so many more people trying to get on, and that just impacts the bandwidth and the latency. So I was curious from that point of view, if you thought that these IoT standards for industrial use and for the security of that information really is intentionally industrial and only industrial, and won't ever sort of morph over to the commercial sector.
I
don't know. It seems like they're really, well, first of all, it's focused on satellite connectivity specifically, kind of linking back to your article, Jennifer. But also, my guess is if they're focused on industrial purposes, there's probably a direct connection to critical infrastructure and securing that, right? Like, because we've all seen some recent glitches over the last year or so, whether it was, natural disaster kind of issues, right, in Texas with power lines going down, due to freezing and things like this, or, a drone in Pennsylvania that they saw, right, with like those copper wires hanging down that was maybe targeting a power grid there a couple years ago, but just became public last summer. So my guess is the security, they're focusing first on the government side of the house and the stakeholders that have a direct connection to critical infrastructure as kind of a starting point, and then figuring out how well that's working and then go from there. When you think about satellites, I think it was you, Jennifer, that said SpaceX throwing up, these thousands of small LEO satellites, low Earth orbit satellites. I'm nerding out a little bit here. I just wrote an article last week that's going to come out inside GNSS magazine, about all the threats to a space-based position navigation timing, PNT. And that includes not just, there is a thing called space weather. Surprise if you didn't know that. Some pretty extreme weather conditions can occur in space, but also, accidental, there's a lot of dead satellites up there, and you don't need a big satellite to crash that's dead and just merely floating around as space junk or space debris to crash into another satellite to cause a problem. All you need is like a BB-sized something or other to hit a satellite, because we're talking, speed, the speed of a bullet is the speed these things are traveling around in space to cause really a catastrophic incident. And so this idea of security in space, this idea of resiliency of our satellites, and when something goes bad, this is like, I guess, bread and butter for you, Jennifer, and your firm. Who is responsible and who is responsible for removing that debris? That's a very big issue in international law. I'm sure, as you know, Jennifer, under some of the treaties, it's the states themselves that have the responsibility for essentially ownership of the assets they put up there. And if they create debris, then, so it's almost like the Wild Wild West in essence up there when it comes to some of these issues. And I think there is a lot of work to be done. It's very exciting to see these developments, but it's also great that people like the IIC are thinking about security, even if it's just for a sliver of, maybe the users out there.
Well, yeah, I mean, these are large concerns, right? Well, you go, Jennifer.
Oh, no, Mike, please, go ahead.
No, I think that, I don't really have that much to say, but that, given what Dawn's saying, we tend to think of like satellite stuff as out of sight, out of mind, but there's a lot more that goes into it in terms of what actually makes what SpaceX is doing kind of phenomenal, and it does seem like satellite has some issues that terrestrial-based stuff doesn't. So in the case of providing extra gap coverage, yeah, that's fantastic. But in the terms of being like a consistent signal, that might lead into what Jennifer was saying about this is why they're kind of trying to keep the scope down to industrial processes, because they can only really guarantee it at that level for a few big stakeholders rather than millions of little consumers tagging the system all at once all the time.
Yeah, and I
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Carla. I'll just jump in real fast. I was also thinking about this in terms of, as we think about the need to secure satellite communications, certainly we've been working on that on the ground, and there's been so much concern about securing our networks, and there is this Secure Networks Act, and it all gets into the supply chain and what is part of the network and how are we securing that, and who's subject to that, and is it just network equipment or does it go beyond that, and the importance of doing that. And I think as we, I've been working in the Secure Networks Act pieces on the ground and the terrestrial networks, and I hadn't actually considered the need to do that with the satellites. Maybe I was assuming some level of encryption that was going to make that more sort of bulletproof. But so I thought it was very interesting that there's a whole group working on ensuring this security because perhaps it wasn't as secure as I had assumed. Over to you, Carla.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that, is that especially when we first started developing those small satellites, those things that could be, developed in a year and thrown up, en masse, from NASA and from private companies, there was very little that was stopping anybody from basically putting something up other than the fact that it had to fit on that particular, payload to go out to be launched. So there's I think there were a lot of great experimentation happening at that point, but also it was very Wild Westy, like Don said, there was not a big guideline that everybody said, oh, okay, you have to minimum encrypt or you have to not broadcast XYZ other than, a couple protected wavelengths there, and there's just a lot of stuff up there, and there's going to be a lot more stuff up there because the space flight's getting easier to get stuff up. The commercial payloads are increasing, the development of small sats is increasing, and I think starting from the industrial side is probably the most critical thing to get right, but I think that those could inform guidelines for future launches, for future devices that are getting up there going forward. If we can start with like a baseline framework that maybe then we can adapt or adjust up and down, depending on if it's consumer or, military or something else. But I think that this is a good step forward just to get started with trying to set some standards for how this communication is going to happen.
Yeah, it reminds me of that movie, Night at the Museum. We're Americans. We don't think, so many times it's like security is an afterthought.
Yes.
But it should be built into every regulation process up front. Think about this for a second, like just the drone situation, right? 2016, the small UAS rule comes out. Just now people are talking about security, right? Remote ID just came out last year. And because Congress kind of forced that in 2018 in the FAA Reauthorization Act, like, hey, you guys really need to think about like identifying who's up there. So, this idea of security and the importance of it, I hope, when we think about other emerging technologies and use cases, things like eVTOL aircraft, advanced air mobility, that some of this stuff, because there's working groups now, you both know this, everybody probably watching this knows this, some congressionally mandating working groups. I hope they're baking security in up front. I hope they're thinking about this from the start, looking at lessons learned, right? Why not? I mean, it's hard work. We know that, but like, let's roll up the sleeves and get that done. So let's transition. This is great stuff. Let's transition to this next one. When you think about security, this is security of communications links, satellite, IoT, but think about the security and safety of cultural resources. And that's really what Carla's article brings up. This conflict in the Ukraine is not the first where cultural items of world and global significance have been targeted for destruction, which is, by the way, as she notes in this article we're going to show here in a second, is completely against international law. We'll get into that a little bit more here. But Carla, could you tell us a little bit about your article?
Sure. So just broadly at Geo Week, we talk a lot about reality capture and some of the applications for capturing things in 3D that can give you more information than, say, a static floor plan or an architectural model. So we follow use cases a lot, in a lot of different industries. And we've covered some things about cultural heritage before, but usually they're in an academic sense. Like, okay, we discovered some ruins somewhere. We'll take 15 years and we'll go study this, extensively. Here, we kind of have a story that's on a incredibly short, dangerous timescale. It's folks on the ground in Ukraine that started their own reality capture company, before the conflict began, and applied what they were doing, applied the techniques that they learned to come in and out of their cultural heritage sites that are churches and other monuments, and try to capture them in as much detail as they can in as quick a way as possible, so that if they are damaged or if they are destroyed, they have some kind of a record of what happened or what it used to look like. And they're a little bit, heartbreakingly cynical in some of the comments that they made, saying that, if this gets destroyed, it's very unlikely we're going to rebuild it exactly the same. It's not going to come back, because of the priorities of rebuilding the rest of the nation. So this capturing some of these assets in 3 dimensions or in a kind of an interactive way may be the last chance for that generation to experience those relics, which is extremely sad, but it's also a great example of how the technology for doing this, for doing photogrammetry, for doing drone captures, things like that, has come to such a level that you can do that by getting in and out of there in a day. Try doing this 5 years ago, it would have been, weeks to capture what they've done in such detail here. And I think it's a really interesting kind of take on not only, just an amazing use case for this technology, but also how it's becoming more democratized. Maybe you don't need a $70,000 scanner to do what they're doing with a couple of cameras, and an older scanner and a commercial drone or a hobby drone, because that's what they have. And it's just an interesting kind of take on that. But the work they're doing is absolutely beautiful. I hope you have a chance to just poke around in it.
So Carla, this company is called Skerion, Skerion.
Yes.
Now, are they Ukrainian or are they from a different country?
Nope,
They
they're
are.
Ukrainian.
Wow.
It's founded by three guys who all went to university together. They all studied various things and decided that they really enjoyed kind of the point clouds and mapping and GIS and things like that. They all kind of got a different specialty. Some of them were on the software side, some of them were more on the capture side. So they decided to go into business together shortly after they graduated, kind of just doing what you do when you're a reality capture company, going into buildings and producing 3D models for people. And then they just completely switched gears and got everybody they knew that could to help them to capture more of these heritage sites.
And so for everybody out there, if you haven't checked it out, it's hashtag Save Ukrainian Heritage is how you can find these guys and what they're doing and support them if you'd like. But Jennifer, I'd love to pick your brain for a second, being a lawyer, myself being one as well. So many law schools don't even teach international humanitarian law, certainly not the law of war like the military knows. I was a JAG. We kind of alluded to in the beginning, this violates the law of war, this violates international law. Can you tell us a little bit about why cultural heritage is so important to the world?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm fully qualified to talk about that topic in depth, but thank you for asking me. I think, certainly our ability as people to relate to each other across borders is essential to our humanity, and probably underlies a lot of the international treaties that we have. And I think this work to essentially provide, digital twinning, if I'm sort of understanding the preservation of these heritage sites, is that is really fascinating. And as I was listening to Carla, I was thinking this kind of digital twinning of what is in the real physical world today and putting that in the metaverse would be kind of an amazing thing, so that we all can continue to experience what culture is like across borders, and help to, achieve better understanding of humans one to another.
You know what, you hit the nail on the head, Jennifer, actually, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but really, when you look at the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict, which, by the way, of course, took years to come to finalization after World War II, and almost the complete destruction of Europe, not to mention, of course, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So when you think about that, the words they use are "quote unquote" damage to the cultural heritage of all mankind. And that really, those words give me chills, because it just underscores the significance, not to necessarily one nation, one group of people, the significance to all of us of these, these cultural heritage sites that are now codified in not only The Hague, but also kind of echoed in the 1977 additional protocols for the Geneva Conventions, the Statute for International Criminal Court in 1998, and the additional protocols to the Hague Convention themselves that were updated in 1999. All of this has become part of customary international law, and this idea that number one, if you have cultural sites, you have a duty as a nation in conflict to try to protect those. And of course, if you're a belligerent on the other side of the fence, you have a duty not to deliberately target those. And of course, we know that a lot of these sites not only get destroyed, but sometimes they just get pilfered. We're still seeing today paintings from World War II, right, that were stolen from Jewish families that are now just being returned. That's also an obligation. Any of these cultural artifacts, there is a duty to return them. And so, that's all under international law. And if you want to really nerd out or learn more about this, because I think it's such an important topic, go to the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC website. They have amazing resources out there, and the ICRC is like the global watchdog for all of these different treaties and international law when it comes to armed conflict.
Yeah, Carla, when I actually came across this article before it was submitted. Normally, I'm always surprised by what the guests bring up, but this issue specifically has been on my mind since one of my Muslim friends brought up how much damage had been done in Syria. This was years ago. He had told me about it, to culturally significant sites, and essentially, I think the thing that kind of tipped him off, I was talking about Notre Dame and how the preservation of that was possible because of drone flights that had been done, or at least this is something that helps in the rebuilding effort, is the fact that we had scans of the building in the first place. And, Wikipedia to this day lists 25 sites that were damaged or destroyed during the main conflict in Syria. It's still somewhat ongoing, right? And those things will never come back. And it's devastating to think that you won't have those things as a reference point to teach history. You might disagree with history as it progresses and we learn better ideas, as we evolve together, but not having the reference point to even discuss it is a loss. It's basically like not being able to tell how much growth actually had been made.
Well, it's really crazy, Mike. You're talking like, what did you say, 20 some? Carla's article notes
like 300
by the end,
so, right?
as of the end of May, you have some crazy statistics in there. I don't know if you want to run through them real quick.
So there were at least 367 incidences of destructions to cultural sites. That includes 29 museums, 133 churches, 66 theaters and libraries, and even a centuries-old cemetery for Jewish refugees. So it's heartbreaking because it's the same thing, is that, these are not coming back. That no one's going to be able to build them in that same way. But I also want to just kind of mention, you had mentioned the metaverse earlier. I think the ability to do this, to be able to go in and really get incredible detail of the interiors and exteriors of some of these places has never been easier to do. And it's only getting easier and faster and better. And I think that there's also just a global need to accelerate the amount of capturing we are doing of our history, because urbanization is happening very rapidly, environmental disasters are happening more rapidly, obviously the constant threat of conflict in the world. I think that we've reached a point where you can even do some of this from an iPhone. I think that there's a lot of potential here to kind of accelerate the kind of almost citizen-driven preservation of cultural artifacts across the world, not just from an academic standpoint, not just from a, I need to study this fresco on this particular wall, but if you have a digitized copy of that asset, you can share that with the whole world. The Smithsonian is doing that with all of the stuff in their collections. They're detailed 3D scanning them and then sharing them to anyone who wants to. You can 3D print your own copy of anything that they have in this digitized 3D collection in the Smithsonian. And I think there's something to be said about reassembling that for other people to go to places that they'll never be able to go, right? Like I can't travel tomorrow inside of a Ukraine church that no longer exists, but I can pan around in that gorgeous 3D model that they made, and kind of have more of a rich experience to that. And I just think it's a call to action for a lot of people to start getting that done.
And coming full circle back to Jennifer's article, as long as you have the internet access to look at it,
Right.
So
Right.
you could see how, here's the four of us all individually picking articles, and, without really reference to the other, that there's this connection.
I'm actually always amazed about how the episode kind of wraps up and ties together. Even though the guests randomly select their articles that mean something to them, right? So
yeah.
It just
Mike, we skipped our thank you to our sponsors, and that was my fault. I don't know if we want to take a minute and do that real quick.
Sure. Yeah. Just want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors. We have Elsight, who is the newest sponsor. We just had Yoav Amitai on our Full Tilt. That's a great episode. If you could go take a look at that. What was the theme on that one, Dawn?
Oh gosh, it was so long. It
Leading boldly.
It was communicating boldly, but leading with. I feel like it was leading with confidence and communicating boldly.
Yep. that was it exactly. So that's a great episode. Please go back and take a look at that. We also have Dragonfly, Vodix, and the Drone Code Foundation. So we'd like to thank our sponsors for making the Full Crew and Full Tilt possible. And just another quick reminder, if you like what you're hearing, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell on YouTube. Or you could go to our website and sign up on fullcrew.io and never miss an episode. So our final article is actually from you, Dawn, and it is also in reference to what's going on in Ukraine in terms of defense. You've been, picking up a lot of these kind of interesting military systems articles lately. So you want to tell us about what's going on here with the Vampire CUAS systems?
Yeah, absolutely. And, UAS Vision is one of those ones that I just have dropping in my inbox every day, like Drone Life and Commercial UAS News and AVS, all the regulars. But, this one really caught my attention because, again, having been military, we just love our acronyms, and this one just cracked me up. Vampire, right? It's like very attention-getting. What it stands for is a vehicle agnostic, modular, palletized ISR rocket equipment. Okay, and that gets you Vampire when you take that whole thing and it becomes an acronym. So basically what it is, it's a giant gun essentially that has, I believe, some AI on board from L3 Harris, counter drone system, portable kit that you can stick on the back of your truck, any truck really. Most vehicles, vehicle agnostic with a cargo bed, can put this thing on there. So it's kinetic, meaning it kills things. Uses a small missile essentially to shoot drones out of the sky. It has an advanced precision kill weapon system that's basically, and you'll love this one too, it reminds me of a Marvel comics, right? Design conversion of the Hydra 70 unguided rockets, but it has a laser guidance kit on it. So that turns it into the precision guided munition here. And they say it creates less collateral damage, which again is important in international humanitarian law when you think about protecting civilians and cultural sites, etc. And it's easily installed. A couple people, common tools, about 2 hours. And so just kind of interesting as we've been talking about the Ukraine and the use of commercial drones in that conflict, the need for systems like this, because drones have really changed the face of warfare. They're so pervasive that now counter UAS is kind of the coin of the realm. So this is just one example. Love the name, just like what we have a couple weeks back, the Angry Kitten, electronic warfare pod, Mike, coming up with these hilarious names. But this one, everybody, the vampires have invaded Ukraine. So I would love to hear Carla's thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as versed for sure on the kind of drone counter drone technology that's out there, but I do think the drive to kind of be as specific as possible, be as targeted as possible, and minimize civilian or other casualties of buildings and other things is a huge plus. And I think that we're really moving towards that being like the standard rather than the abnormal. So anything that we can do to kind of be as precise as possible when we're trying to be strategically, militarily operating, really does lessen the nastier, kind of side effects of conflicts like the conflict in Ukraine. So I'm happy to see that. But also, as someone who I used to work for a NASA contractor, those acronyms, man, we used to keep a list of like the craziest acronyms that we had seen, and people really try to force them in. It's kind of funny. But.
Yeah. So Jennifer, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was actually wondering, Dawn, just based on your own experience, how we might see this kind of technology as tested in war theater coming home to be used, by any of the 4 federal agencies that now have this counter UAS authority here in the UAS to take out drones when necessary. Do you see this particular technology as something that might be used here for other kinds of matters, not war theater, or do you see other kinds of counter UAS technologies as perhaps more prevalent in that realm?
Yeah, I think in the homeland and, kind of steady state, now we're talking kind of human rights law. You used Mike's earlier. You mentioned as a human right, we should have it as a human right. This is more a human rights law applies like in normal day-to-day operations versus in conflict. I think the challenge with an asset like this, unless we're talking like an on the border type situation or over water, if the ground risk, I think, even though this is precision, could be probably too high to be using in Chicago or Philly. And as you know, Jennifer, the right now the authorities for counter UAS are so limited. And here's the really scary thing, everybody. We can talk about like our feds using these assets, okay, like our federal government. And there's only a handful right now that have this authority, which, by the way, is sunsetting in like 30 days under the Preventing Emerging Threats Act. And so that was a big part of that recent White House summit on UAS and AAM, I think in early August. I know, Jennifer, you were a part of that. You tracked that with your clients. So even the feds, like, not a lot of them have that authority. The DoD does. I think that's enduring in 10 USC 130I. But think about bad guys using this. I could throw this thing on the back of my truck. Now, obviously, L3 isn't going to sell this thing, liberally. Just like, I've been working a lot with Northrop Grumman, and they have, I don't want to call it a similar type. I think theirs might even be a little bit more AI ML enabled, because the effector aspect of it, whether you use a laser guided munition, actual laser, you can put anything on theirs. It's called the MACE, the Mobile Acquisition and Queuing Effector, another acronym. So I know they were very interested in like Homeland Security and some of these other federal groups, purchasing that. The legal, kind of hurdles right now, I think, are definitely a limiting factor, even on the federal side. And as we know, the state, local, tribal, territorials, they don't have any of this authority, period. In fact, what I found really shocking about some of the conversations I've heard, whether it was the House or the Senate, Homeland Security Committee had some hearings, right, with DHS, FAA, and DOJ, as well as the White House summit, this idea that everybody needs affirmative authority to even detect. I think that was, and I love your thoughts on that, Jennifer, because I think a lot of people felt that, well, passive RF monitoring, I mean, people do that with CB radios or like, ham radios? I don't know. I think a lot of people felt that was just okay and normal and not a big deal. But to hear all these federal agencies begging Congress for affirmative authority for the ability just to detect at the state level, federal, local, tribal, I was like, wow. And then I also heard the FCC had thrown out a couple of, I don't know if they call them letters of inquiry, LOIs, to a handful of companies, counter drone companies and individuals, like, and how are you doing that again? So that's really significant, I think, this maybe overarching lack of authority. What do you think, Jennifer?
Well, for sure. And there is in the realm of the FCC and preventing people from using counter UAS technologies that are sort of jamming RF frequencies, that the law is pretty clear on that, and the government can do those things, but individuals cannot. But the realm of the ability to pick up any kind of data, whether it's part of the Pen Trap Act, Wiretap Act, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, there are all different ways to look at laws that are already on the books as preventing the ability to both capture electronic information and the mode of that communication. There are many different components to it. And there isn't just the authority to do that. And so that's why they need both the authority for counter UAS and the authority to be able to capture or wiretap this kind of information, even though it seems like it should just be readily available. And it is in fact available, but do you have the ability to tap into that and to use that information? And that really is the question that they're asking for clarity on.
So I think the key thing would be on the detection side, maybe just could a company like petition the FCC and say, hey, almost like on the FAA side, right? Like from a certification standpoint, here's what our product does. Here's how it, hypothetically passively monitors spectrum. Here's how it doesn't interfere with other communications. Can we get a license for this? Can we get approval? Is that possible even today without maybe a congressional statute?
A lot of these are in the U.S. code, and so it's going to require legislation in order to
Wow.
change it.
Wow. Yeah,
So what
so
you're saying,
Congress get a move on. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
well, what you're saying is this is heavily medium dependent, right?
Yeah.
And you brought up CAFA, the way that was written, if I'm maybe I'm incorrect, but wasn't that about, people taking information from corporations or transferring money illegally? Like that's like kind of the context in which that was drafted?
The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
but
and they've tried to like stretch that into like weird ways, right?
Well, nobody could have understood back then that you might consider an aircraft, a drone, to be a device or a computer, right?
Right.
Is it a computer? Yeah, maybe it
Mhm.
is, right? So
Yeah.
I think this is where definitions matter. This is where lawyers are important, and you have to kind of go back to, what was the breadth of what they were trying to address. And even if this wasn't specifically contemplated, could the definitions be considered broadly enough to incorporate these kinds of communications and the intersection of these kinds of communications?
Yeah, wow. And, the interagency, a number of interagency folks put out a really good white paper on this a couple years ago, warning people like, hey, and outlining all these statutes. So if you haven't seen that, just Google interagency white paper or interagency, counter UAS, and it should pop up pretty readily, I would think, in a Google search. So
Yeah,
Jennifer, I think that's on the CISA website, DHS. I know at a minimum it's on DHS's Cybersecurity and Information and Infrastructure Security Agency's website, CISA.
For sure. I think it's actually called the Advisory on the Application of Federal Laws to the Acquisition and Use of Technology to Detect and Mitigate Unmanned Aircraft.
There you go. There you go.
Simple.
Another long one. I'm sure there's an acronym for that too that we haven't figured out. But anyway.
Somebody's
All right.
working on it.
That's right. That's right. Well, Mike, we are getting so close to the top of the hour. The time has flown as usual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would love to. Yeah, go ahead.
No, we've got a lot of cool stuff coming up this week. We're also going to be at Commercial UAV next week doing some broadcasts. So tune in for those. We're going to do our traditional thing, on the floor where Dawn basically grabs at least 10 people to talk about what's going on. I love these because you really do get like a snapshot of what's going on in the industry at kind of the moment when everybody's most excited about it, right? So that's going to be fun. If you're going to Commercial UAV, be sure to contact me and Dawn, or sign up for our email list and reply to the autoresponder. We'll see that, and maybe we can find some time to see you there. There's going to be a lot of action going on. Carla, you're going to be there?
Absolutely. Me and also the content specialist that works with me on Geo Week, we're going as well. So he's going to learn all about drones. It's going to be great.
And like speaking of Geo Week, it's February 13th next year, up in Denver, like my home turf here. I went last year. It was spectacular. So if you've never gone to it, you should. It was a great, great, great event.
Yeah, we're
and
looking forward to both.
Yes, absolutely. And speaking of commercial UAV, I'd be remiss not to mention, shamelessly plug our annual Flash Mob Networking Happy Hour. If you can get in, if you can travel on Labor Day on Monday, come in a little early, 7 p.m. You heard it here first. The location is going to be Gilly's Saloon at TI or Treasure Island, 7 p.m. on Monday. So meet us there, join us for a beverage, get to meet some people early. We had a ton of fun last year at the Mirage. We just rallied at the lobby bar. This one's a little bit more dispersed, so Gilly's was kind enough to say, come on down. So we are really excited about that. And
we've got another first that we're announcing today, right, Dawn?
Yep, I'm going to hand it off to Jennifer to do that.
All right.
Yeah, happy to do it. So, well, we just love the work that Dawn and Mike are doing to evangelize new technologies out there and some of the critical issues that we all need to be thinking about with respect to these new technologies. And so Akin Gump will be working with them to put on some webinars, podcasts in the fall, October, November, December. that really brings to the fore the exciting work that the Akin Gump technology practice is doing in AI, ML, autonomous systems, advanced mobility, and crypto and blockchain. So we'll be bringing lawyers to those conversations along with the clients that we're representing on really exciting and interesting projects, and hope to bring some really exciting content to the viewers and listeners here.
Yeah, we're really appreciative, Jennifer. And Akin Gump, for those that didn't know, did also sponsor our Law Tech Connect workshop that we held with AUVSI as a co-located event in Orlando in April. And this idea of law, policy, regulation, it's so inextricably intertwined with emerging technologies. And that's the only way, if we have these conversations, that we're going to be able to advance and the operalization of all of these technologies at scale in a more rapid manner. So really excited to work on you with that.
Yeah, I'm super excited too. I mean, I've worked with Jennifer for years when I was chair at Interdrone, and some of the conversations we've had about technology in the halls of that show and just in general in between are some of the most informative I've had in my life. So I'm happy that we're gonna actually be able to share that. Not just Jennifer, other Akin Gump. Yeah.
Yeah, and let me say, so what has been so amazing to me talking with my colleagues who are doing a lot of this work is, these are trade lawyers, IP lawyers, environmental lawyers, lawyers working on transportation issues, telecom issues, of course, but it's really some of these other areas, import and export of this technology and the environmental impacts of these technologies that is totally fascinating, and the work is robust. So great to be able to share some of that.
Yeah, looking forward to nerding out. So, Dawn, we've got some stuff coming up you want to tell everybody about?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. Tomorrow we have our full crew Twitter Spaces. So join us on Twitter. We have Chris Lewis from an incredible nonprofit called Vets to Drones visiting with us, as well as John McHale from Military Embedded Systems. A little bit of a military flavor for this one tomorrow, possibly. And then Wednesday on the Dawn of Drones podcast, presented by Drone Life, 9 a.m. Mountain, we have our last guest of the month for Developing Industry Leaders Month that was sponsored by Skydio. We've got Marcy Eisenberg of the Accelerate Unmanned Technology Center of Excellence campus in Leesburg, Virginia. I call this like the East meets West drone training episode. We have Christopher Robertson from CSU's Drone Center here in Fort Collins, Colorado. So the two of them will be on that. And then this Thursday, we've got Tony Drummond from both Prestige Air Group and Global Aero Management Group, General Aviation Drones, kicking off a month of dedicated to incredible market use cases in the industry. So really excited about that. We'll be live with Tony next week in Vegas at Commercial UAV and some of our other guests. Let's see, next Monday real quick, Cameron Shell from Dragonfly will be on the full crew with Vidyut, long last name, I'm going to mess it up, so read the tile, from Bellwether Industries. If you haven't heard of Bellwether, they're out of the UK and they're literally making flying cars. So really, really cool designs. And then next Tuesday, we've got Jamar Williams from Promo Drone on the Full Tilt Leadership Podcast with the theme of leading with your truth. And that's going to be a spectacular episode. So join us for all of these. We love to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today, and for all of our followers and fans out there.
Yep. Thank you. And I guess we'll see you all at ComUAV.
Yeah.
Out
Thanks
here.
so much for having me. See you all next week.
Out here.